So we have covered everything you need to know about sizing elements. Going forward, we're going to talk about various techniques for positioning elements and creating layouts. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how you can precisely position elements on the screen. So let's start off by creating a div with the class of boxes. Inside this div, we want to have 3 divs, each with the class of box. So div.box times 3. Okay, now let's define a few styles. So for our boxes container, we're going to define a border of 3 pixels, solid, light gray. And for each box, we're going to define a width of 5 rem and height of 5 rem. Now here I'm using a relative unit that is dependent on the font size of the root element, but we could also use percentages, pixels, and so on. That is irrelevant here, okay? Now, I want each box to have a different color. So I don't want to apply the background color property here. Instead, we're going to go to our markup and give each box an extra class. So here we can say box 1, box 2, and box 3. So each element can have multiple classes separated by a space, okay? Now, for our box 1, we're going to set the background color to gold. For box 2, we're going to set the background color to tomato. And for box 3, we're going to set the background color to Dodger blue. Let's see what we get up to this point. So very basic layout. Now in this lesson, we're using these abstract boxes, but in a real scenario, these boxes could be anything. We could have images, headings, paragraphs, any kind of elements. That is irrelevant. What we want to talk about now is positioning. So let's say we want to position this second box and move it a little bit to the right. This is where we use the position property. So here's our second box. First, we set the position to. Here we have a few values like absolute, fixed, relative, static, and so on. By default, the position of all elements is static, which means they're not positioned. They appear exactly in their normal position. Now, to position this element, first we should change the position property to relative. So we can position this element relative to its normal position. Now, using these properties like top, right, bottom, and left, we can move this box around. So if we set left to 5 rem, we're going to add 5 rems of space on the left side of this box, and this will push the box to the right side. Now here we can also use a negative value like -4, and this will move the box to the left side. So look, it's off the screen. This is a very popular technique for creating elements that are initially off the screen, and then using some fancy animations, they pop to existence. So we can set the left property to a positive or a negative value. Once again, I'm using a rem unit here, but it doesn't mean we should always use the rem unit to set the left property. The unit we use depends on what we're building. Sometimes pixels make sense, other times percentages, rems, and so on. So here's the left property. We also have the right property. If we set this to 4 rem, this is exactly like setting the left property to -4 rem. So let's delete this, and look, we get the same result. Now let's set this back to left. We also have top and bottom. So we can add some space on top of the box, let's say 2 rems, and this moves the box down. Or we can add space from the bottom. Let's say 4 rems. So here's what we get. Now, one thing I want you to pay attention to here is that the yellow and the blue boxes are exactly where they're supposed to be. They are not affected by positioning this element, okay? Also, note that here we have overlapping. This orange element appears on top of the yellow element because it comes last in the DOM, but we can easily change the stacking order of these elements. So back to the second box, we can set the z-index property to a positive or a negative value to move this box along the z-axis. So on web pages, we have 3 axes. The horizontal axis, which is also called the x-axis, the vertical axis, which is the y-axis, and the z-axis, which represents depth. You can think of it like a line that comes from the screen towards your eyes, okay? Now, by default, the z-index property of all elements is 0. If we set this to a positive value like 1, this element moves closer to us. If we set it to a negative value, it moves away from us. So now I've set this to -1, and look, our orange box is behind the yellow box because the z-index property of the yellow box is 0. If we set it to a positive value, now it appears on top of the yellow box, okay? Now, the value that we set here doesn't really matter. We could set it to 1, 2, 100, whatever. Sometimes people use magic numbers like a bunch of 9s. Everyone has their own preference. What matters is that the higher this number, the higher that element will move up the z-axis, okay? So with relative positioning, we can move an element relative to its normal position, and this does not impact the other elements on the page. Now, in contrast to relative positioning, we have absolute positioning. With absolute positioning, we can position an element relative to its container. Let me show you how to do this. First, we have to go to that container and set the position property to relative. This is really important. If we want to position our orange box relative to its container, the container must be positioned relatively, okay? Now, we go to our second box and set the position to absolute. Then, we're going to set right to 0 and bottom to 0. And by the way, whenever you use the 0 number, you don't need to specify a unit, okay? So now let's save the changes and see what we get. So our orange box is positioned relative to its container. It's on the bottom right corner of this container, okay? Now here's the important part. Look at the blue box. The blue box moved up. Previously, the orange box was here and the blue box was right below. But now that we're absolutely positioning the orange box, the blue box moved up. Why is this happening? Well, when we absolutely position an element, that element is removed from the normal flow of the page, which means from the parent's point of view, that element doesn't exist. You can imagine it's on a separate layer. So this container only sees these two boxes. The orange box is on a different layer, and this has nothing to do with the z-index property. All I'm saying is that when we absolutely position an element, that element is removed from the normal flow of the page, and all the other elements are rendered as if the absolutely positioned element doesn't exist, okay? So to recap, with absolute positioning, we can position an element relative to its container. And for this to happen, the container should be positioned relatively, okay? Now, sometimes we want to position an element relative to the viewport. For example, we want to have a navigation bar that always stays on the top. So back to the second box, let's set the position to fixed. We don't need the right property anymore. Let's just set top to 0. If you pay close attention, the orange box is now outside of our container because it's positioned relative to the viewport, which is this visible area of the browser. So this element is always going to stay on the top, even if you scroll down. To demonstrate this, I'm going to give the body element a height of 200 VH, which means 200% of the height of the viewport. So whatever the height of the viewport is, we're going to multiply it by 2, and that makes our page longer. So now let's scroll down. Look, the orange box always stays on the top, like a top navigation bar. Now, one last thing before we finish this lesson. There are two ways to set the size of positioned elements. One way is to use the width and height properties, which is what we have done so far. Another way is to use the combination of left and right or top and bottom. For example, for our second box, let's set left to 2 rems, right to 2 rems. Now, if we save the changes, nothing happens because we have explicitly set the width and height of these boxes. But for the second box, what we can do now is, here we set the width to auto and let the browser decide how wide this box should be. Now, look at the result. Look, here we have 2 rems of space on the left and the right side of the box. And if we resize the window, our box is going to keep this proportion. So let's quickly recap. With relative positioning, we can position an element relative to its normal position. The other elements are not affected. With absolute positioning, we can position an element relative to its positioned container. That's why we had to apply a relative position on the container. And finally, with fixed positioning, we can position an element relative to the viewport.